like Roy said, I'm going to talk about statistics done wrong, because we statisticians have this tendency when we read papers in other fields, we say, oh no, that doesn't make any sense, that's not right. And we complain to each other, and then we never do anything about it. We just sort of build this literature in the statistics field, complaining about how everyone else does it, but we never try to actually help them fix it. So I've been trying to solve that problem. So I, over the past couple of years, have been really interested in common errors in statistics. I ended up writing a book and a website on common errors in statistics called Statistics Done Wrong. So you can find there all of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and a bunch of other fun examples. So I'm going to go through some basic statistical concepts. It's kind of hard for me to know how much everyone in the audience knows or doesn't know about the statistics. So if you've got questions, something I said makes no sense, just stop me and ask questions, that's fine. But let's just get right into it. There we go. So, 3 basic problems in statistics done in experimental studies. Most of the studies that in most of science have inadequate sample sizes, which means they're probably not able to find what it is that they think they're looking for. But many of these studies at the same time test many different hypotheses. And I don't mean scientific hypotheses. I mean statistical hypotheses. They do many different tests. They have a wall of p-values in their paper. And this means they have many opportunities for false positives. And often they use these tests even when they don't need them, when there's no good reason to have a test for whatever conclusion they're trying to draw. So when you combine these, this means that most statistically significant results presented in scientific papers are likely false positives or exaggerated. They're larger than they should be. Now don't just take my word for it. Here's a paper from 2005, helpfully titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. This was in a medical journal. I really like the opening sentence. There's increasing concern that most current published research findings are false. In this wonderful deadpan, like, it's just this little problem. But the idea here was not an empirical study where they had tested most research findings and found they were false. It was based off of how the statistics are used, how people use statistical significance testing. So I think the best way to illustrate how people do the significance testing wrong is to give an example of one particular published research finding which is false. So some of you may remember this from last year. There was a paper presented that was trying to replicate this result. So in Psychological Science in 2009, there was a paper which asked the question, do fonts alter disclosure of sensitive information? So for instance, if I ask you a question like, if I could get into a movie without paying and nobody would notice, would you do it? And the idea here is most people honestly would say yes, but they realize on a survey they probably shouldn't say yes. The idea is, if we present that question to them in a hard-to-read font, like this sort of gray, italic, smaller text, then it'll take them longer to understand the question, so they'll have more time to realize, wait, maybe I should say no, even though that's not necessarily true. So they were interested in, maybe there's ways of making people think about their privacy by how you present the questions. So how would you answer this statistically? So you have 2 groups of people who fill out a survey. One group fills out a hard-to-read survey. One group fills out an easy-to-read survey. And there's like 20 or 30 questions like this one about, what kind of a temper you have and all these things. And then you compare the average number of undesirable answers given by the people who did the hard-to-read survey and the people who used the easy-to-read survey. So you look at those percentages. You have 2 numbers, the average undesirable answers for one group, the average for the other group. And statistically, if you're going to do a significance test, you start with a separate question. You start by asking, what would I expect to see if font made no difference at all? Didn't matter. Oh, I would probably expect to get about the same answer for each font. Yes?
It just occurred to me to ask you, if you have two groups, how would you know that maybe the people in one group just didn't happen to be more honest than the people in the other group?
Right. So how do you know that the groups aren't systematically different in some way? So you would have to randomly assign people to groups, randomly assign which survey they got, so there would be no systematic problem. Then the question is, how much random variation would you expect, right? And the random variation is what this question is meant to answer, saying how much random variation would I expect to see? So you'd expect that you get about the same answers for each font, yes?
I think the second part of the answer is sample size.
Right.
So if you have a small sample size, then it's more likely, even if you randomly assign them to groups, that you'll get differences. But if you have a larger sample size, then that's less likely to happen.
Because everything sort of averages out. So you'd assume that if font didn't matter, you'd get roughly equal percentages for the two groups, but with some random variation. Like we said, with a larger sample size, that random variation would be much smaller. So graphically, so first, then once you get a result, you collect actual data, you compare your result to what you'd expected if font didn't matter. And if your result is very different from what would happen if font didn't matter, then you say, well, clearly font must matter. And let me illustrate that graphically. So this is the experimental outcomes you would expect if font didn't matter. So the most likely outcome is that there's zero difference between the two groups because font doesn't matter. So that's the most likely outcome, but there's some random variation. So you could sometimes see a 10% difference, 10% increase in disclosure, or a 10% decrease in disclosure when you run the experiment. So I've highlighted here in red, this is the area that decreases in disclosure caused by this hard-to-read font, which happen only 5% of the time or less. So these are the results which would be very rare to get if font didn't matter. So this is how we choose our statistical significance threshold. We say, all right, 20%. If we see a 20% decrease or more, that would be rare unless font actually mattered. So if we see that, we conclude font matters. So now suppose it turns out that in truth, the hard-to-read font decreases disclosure by 10%. So what would we see in that case? So I've overlaid here the results, the most likely results if font decreased disclosure by 10%. So you see on average, you'd see a 10% decrease in disclosure when you run your study. But there's that same random variation there. So some of the time you may see no decrease at all. Some of the time you may see a 20% decrease. And you can see that it's actually fairly unlikely for you to get into the statistically significant region, because the statistical significance region starts at you seeing a 20% decrease in disclosure. So this is a problem of sample size. Because our sample is too small, that random variation is large, those curves are wide. If I quadrupled my sample size, those would be half as wide. And with the quadrupled sample size, now when I choose my threshold for statistical significance, it's at 10% instead of 20% because there's less random variation. So now it's much easier to get a statistically significant result when font really does cause a 10% decrease in disclosure. So this is, I think Roy mentioned this yesterday, this is the problem of statistical power. Power is the probability that we will detect the effect we're looking for, assuming that it does actually exist. So the power, for instance, in that first situation where the threshold was at 20%, our power was only 16%, because most of the time you would not have gotten a statistically significant result. So your power depends on your sample size, like we said. Larger sample size means better power. It also depends on the size of the effect you're looking for. If you're looking for a really tiny effect, you're going to need a tremendously large sample, so that random variation will be very small. And it also depends on your significance threshold. So I chose to do a 5% threshold. I said these are the results that happen 5% of the time. You could choose 1% if you're paranoid, but that means that you get even less statistical power. It's even harder to find statistically significant results. So let's go back to that font study. Because back at Laser last year, there was a group that presented a paper where they tried to replicate that study. And they wanted to expand upon it and do something different. But first they tried replicating it. They went on Amazon Mechanical Turk. They got 390 people to complete the survey for a couple bucks. And there was no statistically significant result. So they thought, well, that's strange. But maybe it's because we put the survey online. Maybe the people on Mechanical Turk aren't the same as the undergrads who did this first study. So let's do it with the same sort of population. So they got a bunch of undergrads to come into their lab and do the survey on a tablet. So 93 undergrads filled out the survey. Still no statistically significant result. So they say, okay, but we looked back, we realized the original study was on paper. Maybe it matters that we did it on a computer screen instead of paper. Maybe the font is presented differently or something. So they tried it on paper with 80 students. Still no statistically significant difference. Finally, they said, okay, let's just go back to the original study, ask them for their exact survey form, printed in exactly the same fonts in exactly the same way, do it exactly the way they did. So they got 59 undergrads to do this. Still no statistically significant result. But I went back then, and I calculated statistical power. I said, assume the original study was right, that the difference was, I think it's about a 15% decrease in disclosure. Assume that's right. What power would you expect to get with this many participants? Turns out that they hadn't calculated power. The power varied from 99.5% for Mechanical Turk, which is complete overkill, to about 40% when they did the most important study, the exact replication. So now when you look at that exact replication and you say, oh, it's not statistically significant, now I'm not sure what to believe. Because even if their original study was right, we probably wouldn't have gotten a statistically significant result when we replicated. So how conclusive is this evidence that they presented when they did the exact replication? Now, even when you combine all of the different ways they did the survey, it's still not statistically significant and has ridiculous power. But then you have to assume that putting the survey on a computer screen or on a tablet does not change anything about how people respond. And that's something you have to prove by an experiment. So what sample size would they have needed to get 80% power, which is for some reason sort of a standard number in power? They would have needed about 150 people to fill out the survey. In their case, I think they were paying the undergrads in candy bars. So you need a couple trips to Costco to get the candy bars, and a lot of lab time to have grad students to supervise. And so that's a lot of work to get 150 students to fill out the survey. But they could have avoided all of that because once I calculated this, I looked back at the original study and I noticed they only had 33. And so I thought, well, how could that happen? So last year, the group who presented at Laser, they had obtained from the original authors the Excel spreadsheets, all the calculations. And they realized that they used a completely inappropriate statistical test to calculate their results. They were using a paired t-test when it made no sense to do a paired t-test. And their results weren't actually statistically significant at all. So A, if they had done a power calculation before they started their study, their application would have been much more conclusive, but also they could have saved themselves a lot of time because they would realize the study they're trying to base this on is wrong. And they could have potentially, they could have started at the exact replication, or they could have realized maybe this isn't worth our time, depending on their goals. So, there's another problem that you might have seen in the plots that I showed you, which is that when your sample size is too small, not only will you not get statistically significant results very often, but the ones you do will be overestimates. So let's look at that graph again. So I showed you. I said, suppose the true difference is 10%, but our statistical significance threshold is at 20% because our sample size is too small. There's too much random variation. So that means most of the time I run this experiment, I'm not going to get a statistically significant result. But when I do get a statistically significant result, I will be exaggerating the truth by a factor of 2 or 3. I think on average it's about 2.5. So when you do get a statistically significant result with this study, I mean, you've gotten lucky, but also, the next person to do the study later on is going to say, oh, well, it didn't turn out as dramatic as they thought it was. I wonder why that happened. And then the New Yorker will write articles on the decline effect and, annoy you. But this happens a lot in fields like fields where it's easy to do lots of small studies very quickly. So genetics has had to confront this problem because suddenly they're able to do all of these microarrays, all of these experiments and sequencing very fast. So one group can spend a couple months, put out a paper, and say, oh, we proved that gene X causes condition Y with great certainty. And then 3 months later, another group says, well, actually, it doesn't really do that much. So this is also why you see papers like, for instance, why beautiful parents have more daughters than ugly parents. I left that part out. This was in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. It was also by the same authors who wrote things like, engineers have more sons, nurses have more daughters. So there is a biological hypothesis. It's called the generalized Trivers-Willard hypothesis, which I really love saying. The Trivers-Willard hypothesis suggests that if you have a trait which will benefit a kid of one gender over the other, you will tend to have kids of that gender. So plausibly that could cause this, except the biologist could at most explain like a 0.3% difference in how many daughters or sons you have. These papers claimed a 20% difference. And it turns out, A, their sample size was too small, even though they had 3,000 people in the studies. When you're looking for a 0.3% difference, you need a ridiculously large sample. But also, so on reanalysis and replication, it turned out that they made a bunch of other statistical mistakes. So it turns out that it may be true that beautiful parents have more daughters, but not that many more daughters. Actually, I think someone did a study where they looked through People magazine's annual list of beautiful people and counted how many sons and daughters they had and failed to replicate this result. But there's not enough people on People magazine's list to get the statistical power you need. So if a paper makes a surprisingly large discovery, they've found something which is startlingly large, but they have a fairly small sample size, maybe it's true there's an effect, but you should think, this is probably exaggerated. This is probably too big. We need a larger sample to nail this down. So, to give you some intuition, it's easy to say, well, I think about 100 people will be the right sample size. But give you some intuition into how much you might need. Suppose we're testing these malware warnings that you get in your browser when you visit a suspicious website. And suppose it's the case that about 20% of users completely ignore this warning, go to the website anyway, get infected, cause you all sorts of pain. And we think that a scarier warning might cut this rate in half. Now, I've made up the numbers. I don't really know how many people click past it, but suppose it's 20%. And we want to cut this in half. So we want to do an experiment where we get half the people to use the old version, half the people to use the new version. What sample size do you think we might need total to get good power? Now nobody wants to answer because that scares you. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Take a really large number, that's probably safe. Okay, so it turns out that it's about 400. So if you were doing, for instance, an eye tracking study, you wanted to see how people read this form, how they react to the warning. That's a whole lot of equipment, that's a whole lot of time to run this study. That'd be marvelously expensive to do for something that's cutting this rate in half. That seems like a large effect. But the sample size you need is still surprisingly large. So I think a lot of people, when they're doing their experiments, they just sort of eyeball it and they say, well, 60 people should be enough to do this. And then they get no statistical significance and they don't know why. Yeah.
Do you think it's the case that these things happen because people just don't know about power and sample size?
So I think part of the problem is, I'm going to talk in a minute about multiple comparisons and how that makes it easy to get false positives. So what you'd think would happen if people had inadequate power all the time is they'd never get statistically significant results. And so then they realize, I must be doing something wrong. But it turns out that even with low power, people do enough tests in their paper that at least one of them is going to come out significant. So they always have something to point to and say, hey, look, I found something. And they never realize that what they're doing isn't working. Other questions?
So how, and maybe this would be better for later in the talk, I'm not sure, but how can we deal with instances of low statistical power when we have, how can we correctly deal with instances of low statistical power when we can only find like 20 people, or,
Yeah.
you know, for example, the eye tracking study, I've known people who've done eye tracking and getting 400 people is very difficult.
Yeah, and you can imagine like a medical study, there may not be 400 people with the rare disease you need them to have. So that's difficult. I would possibly say that in cases like this, and I'll talk about it later, you may not want a statistical test. It may not be what you're interested in. Maybe what you're interested in is an effect size and an error bar that says, well, the effect is somewhere between here and here. And that can at least help you narrow down, you know, the plausible effect of your drug or your study. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. Yes.
Yeah, I've got two quick questions. Maybe I missed this when you introduced the power earlier, but why only 80%? Why not higher? And my other question is, what's the risk of having too large a sample size other than just the added cost for the study?
Right, so for the first question, why 80%? This is like asking why 5% significance. I think basically someone picked 80% power 50 or 60 years ago, and everyone else copied them because they thought it sounded safe. But that's something when you're designing a study, you need to decide what power do you think is necessary for your study. And the larger your power is, you know, the more sample size you're going to need. So it's a sort of a trade-off in cost. Your second question was just split
The risk,
right.
the risk if the sample is too large.
So if the sample size
cost.
If your sample size is ridiculously large, you know, there's the expense, but also if the true effect is very small, then you're always going to get statistical significance, and you're going to publish a paper saying, I found something statistically significant, even if the effect you found is really tiny and nobody actually cares about it. So that, for instance, that Facebook study that was so controversial this summer, where they manipulated emotions on news feeds, they have a ridiculous sample size because they're Facebook, but the total effect in how people reacted was like 0.1% or 1% maybe. So, you know, they said, oh, we have highly statistically significant results. But what they really proved was that they're actually pretty bad at manipulating your emotions. So that's what happens when you get a really large sample size. You're pretty much bound to get statistical significance. It's just a question of whether you care about the result you got. So a good sample size can be calculated in advance, like I did in a couple of these examples. You can Google for statistical power calculators. All the big statistical software packages know how to do it, except for Excel, I think. There may be plugins for it. Excel doesn't know it natively. And power calculations have become mandatory in some journals. So for a long time, for instance, Nature, nobody reported power at all. But now Nature's put a checklist. They said, if you want us to believe your study, here's the things you need to put in the report so we can evaluate it. One of the first things on the list is how did you choose your sample size? There's reporting guidelines in medicine that are on a similar vein, saying if these are the things you need to report for us to believe you, and one of them is, again, sample size, how many people have dropped out, all those sorts of things. Now, the power calculators, I should mention, do not cover truth inflation, as I call it, that exaggeration effect. So you want a good power, but you have to keep in mind that even with good power, you'll be exaggerating a little bit on average. So here's the problem though. Collecting enough data is expensive, like we mentioned before. So why not start small? And maybe we'll get lucky and we'll get a statistically significant result. Or maybe we'll have to keep adding more subjects to our study until either we get significance or we run out of money and time, or we hit the conference deadline. So if you get a significant result early, you get to stop early, saves you a lot of effort. If you don't, well, nothing really lost. You would have had to collect that much data according to the power calculation anyway. But I've labeled this a problem and given it a cool name, which means it's probably a problem. This is actually the physicist's name for it, the keep looking bias. I have a prejudice that physicists name things better than statisticians do, because the statisticians call it sampling to a foregone conclusion. Because the problem is, it makes false positives and exaggeration more likely. The statistical name sort of suggests why. You're sampling until you get significance, so you're going to get significance. And to see that, let's look back at that malware study, the malware warning study. Suppose instead of 200 people per group, like I said we needed, suppose we started with 10, because that's nice and easy. And if the test isn't statistically significant, we recruit one more person to each group. And we keep doing that until we get a statistically significant result. Or, it's gotten too expensive, we run out of candy bars to give the test subjects. Whatever. Conference deadlines tomorrow, we have to publish. And suppose, for the sake of argument, that the new warning that we're using actually is no better than the old one. It's not scary enough to convince the users not to click through. So suppose there's no actual true difference to be found in our study. So here's what might happen. This is a simulation. So here's our p-value for our statistical significance test. We start off with a small sample size and we keep increasing it. Remember I said we needed 200 people per group, so we start with 10. So what happens, you start off, you're not statistically significant. That's what you'd expect. There's no difference to be found. But you start adding people, and you start adding people, and you get it to around 40 or 50, and suddenly you have statistical significance. You have a false positive. And then you would stop and you'd say, hey, I win. Or if you had continued and you'd gone to where you said you should go, to 200, you'd go off the side of that chart, you'd go over there, and you'd only have a 5% chance of getting a false positive, like the significance test says you should. But when you do it this way, I've tested many more times, so I've had many chances of a false positive. So now it turns out it's about a 20% chance of getting a false positive when you run the simulation many times, instead of a 5% chance. So you've quadrupled your error rate. And also, of course, truth inflation comes into this as well. The times you stop early are the times when the result is exaggerated, is large. So you've probably exaggerated the size of the result if there is one. And if there isn't one, it's just a false positive.
That example, this is similar to, I would say, to the example you gave earlier about someone using a dependent t-test instead of an independent t-test. It's simply wrong.
Yeah.
And there are formal statistical methods for the methodology, it's called sequential statistics.
Right.
Where you would apply appropriate statistical tests to this situation.
Right.
So the problem is it's not only inadvisable, but it's just as wrong because you're using incorrect statistical testing.
Right. So actually, I'm about to mention sequential testing. I should say this applies even if you don't have infinite time and data. If you have infinite time and data, you're guaranteed to get a statistically significant result eventually. Because you're going to stop when you get statistical significance. So when you stop, you got statistical significance. Was there a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if when you start getting early results and you don't have significance. Go back to that figure for a second. Let me get in terms of that. Suppose that your result goes from your first measurement to the point of significance in a monotonically clean way, so it's not reversing, it's going so that you always have a trend. You always add one more, the result gets better, you add one more, the result gets better. Is that any sort of a clue that you are probably on the right track? Here we see some substantial reversals that says
Yeah.
it's not clean, that there are other things going on, then each one adds more power to the test.
So I think you would see that sort of thing if you had very little random variation
Yeah.
in subjects. Then you might see that. But if there's any random variation from subject to subject, then you would see reversals like this one.
So if you have a model that says, this ought to be the effect, and, it becomes more likely that your model is correct if everybody you test has the behavior the model predicts.
Yeah, I could try simulating that or something. I'd have to see how often that actually happens.
I suspect it doesn't happen very often at all,
Yeah.
because we usually don't have well understood laws, physical or otherwise, in the things we're testing, or we probably wouldn't be using statistics.
Yeah. So there have been surveys that have asked academic scientists whether they do this sort of thing. And when you give them, the right assurances that this is completely anonymous, and give them incentive to give the truth, most scientists will admit we have to do this to get statistical significance. You don't have the money to run the full sample size. We have to do this. So they admit they do it in their published studies. They also admit it's probably indefensible, and it is. And if you're reading a paper where they say, oh, we had a sample size of 67 people, and they don't say where 67 came from, how they chose that number, this could have easily have happened. And the result they got, you're not sure if the false positive rate they claim with their significance test is inflated, whether the result is exaggerated. You're not sure what really happened. And like we heard, there is a field of sequential analysis which is built, I think, largely for medical trials. It applies to any kind of study like this. Because in medicine, you have to be able to stop early. If your new drug is killing twice as many as the placebo does, you probably want to stop the trial early. So there's a whole group of procedures on how to do this without increasing your false positive rate, without causing these problems. I think truth inflation is still a problem there. Medical studies which stop early tend to have results which are slightly exaggerated compared to ones that didn't stop early. But you can cure the false positive problem. Yes.
In medical studies, when there is a positive result for a drug or treatment, don't they also decide to apply it to all the patients if they think there's a positive overall effect? What about that?
Yeah, so they will, if there's a statistically large effect early on that suggests the drug works, then yeah, they think it's unethical to keep giving it keep giving a placebo to the control group. So they will stop early. But like I said, that's when truth inflation becomes a problem. And those studies tend to exaggerate the effect of the drug by about 20% on average. There have been reviews that compare these to studies which did not stop early.
So since you know that truth inflation is a problem, can you deflate the result and say, okay, we have a truth inflation of 20%, so what we should claim is 80% of the effect as the best
So,
realistically we would get if we carried it out.
Right. So the problem is that to know how much to deflate the result, you need to know what the true effect size is. So there are, I think in genetics, people have started developing procedures to try to do this, sort of use the estimated effect and deflate. The problem is this puts the error bars on your final result to be enormously wide, because there's so much uncertainty in that calculation. So on the one hand, now your error bars are sort of more faithful to the truth, but they're also a lot less useful. There's a trade-off. It would be nice if there were sort of a standard factor I could give you. Just say, cut everything you see in half, and that's about reasonable. But I don't think there's a single rule of thumb threshold that you could use. So, this is a part of another problem, multiple comparisons that I've mentioned a couple times before. The more tests you run, the more opportunities you have to get a false positive. It's just like flipping a coin. The more times you do it, the more times you have a chance of getting heads, anything like that. So, as an example, I'm going to unfairly pick on a paper earlier this year about business networking websites and how people share data on these websites. And this is a small part of a larger study. They were interested in how they could phrase the questions, how that would influence how people responded. But one small part of it was, they wanted to see how sensitive users thought these questions were. So they had 27 questions about your age and your education and where you live, all that sort of stuff. And they gave you a scale of 1 to 7, how sensitive is this question? So they went through all 27. And then they had 9 categories of people who might be users on a business networking site like LinkedIn. And they said, for each of these categories of people, how trustworthy do you think they are? How much do you trust your colleagues or your family or so on? Because maybe that influences who you want to share with on a networking website. And then they were interested in finding out, we have 3 types of people filling out this survey. We have people who've never even heard of LinkedIn or anything like it, people who've heard of them but aren't members, and we have people who are currently members of a business networking website. Maybe their answers differ between those 3 groups. Maybe the current members of networking websites think these questions are less sensitive and that's why they're willing to be a member. Maybe there's some effect like that. So they had 27 personal questions and 9 categories of people. So they did 36 statistical hypothesis tests, 1 for every question they asked. They asked, is this question different between the 3 groups? So when you run 36 tests instead of 1, the chance of getting a false positive is no longer 5%, because you've had 36 chances at it. If there were no difference at all between the 3 groups, you'd have an 84% chance of getting at least 1 false positive. On average, you'd see about 2, because that's 5% of 36. And in this particular study, they claimed 1 statistically significant result. Apparently, people who are currently members of a networking website think their colleagues are more trustworthy than people who aren't members of this networking website. And I don't think they had a reason why they thought that makes sense or why that would happen. But they had 1 statistically significant result. And now when I looked at the results, I thought, well, we'd expect them to get 2 false positives even when there's no difference at all between the groups. And they got a false positive, or they got a statistically significant result. Should I really believe it? I mean, this could have easily have happened from a false positive. Maybe it's true. Now, I don't know whether to believe it. So, you can calculate, do the basic probability sort of math, and work out, you start off doing 1 test, you have a 5% chance of getting at least 1 false positive. You go up to doing 80 tests or so, you've got basically a 100% chance of getting at least 1 false positive. There's a formula from probability you can use to calculate this if you like testing it for a particular study. But I looked through other papers at the same conference to see how bad is this problem. Several of the papers did more than 100 hypothesis tests. I think I counted 400 in one paper. Because they just tested everything. We're going to compare this group to this group on these 500 different questions. We're going to test this and this. Many of the papers had more than 20 tests. And this is probably an underestimate. Right? Because you only report the significance tests that are interesting enough to go in the paper. So if they did a bunch of other tests that had no statistically significant results and turned out not to relate to their main point, they probably didn't mention them at all. So they probably had even more chances for false positives. And none of the papers I looked at specified why they chose the sample size they had. Usually it was just, I think a lot of them were Mechanical Turk. So it sort of smells like they just said, well, I have a couple $100 in Mechanical Turk account right now, so I'll just use that and see what I get. Question.
Suppose, as these guys, you as a researcher were in a position where you could have tested some number of hypotheses. but you didn't. You only tested one.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that you just got lucky and you picked that one hypothesis where you got a significant result. What then? Am I making
So-
sense here?
So are you
Right.
wondering whether, sort of, how many possible tests there are to get false positives on, whether that affects how you should think about your results when you only did one test?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your answer. So or it might be because I asked the question in a strange way.
Okay.
If you had tested n hypotheses and you had done what I think you may be about to tell us about the correction for multiple hypothesis testing, then you wouldn't end up with a significant result. Right?
Yeah.
But you did not test multiple hypotheses. You only tested one.
Right.
And it just happens that the one that you tested came out significant.
Right.
But if you had tested n hypotheses and applied the correction, then it wouldn't be significant.
Right.
So, you see what I mean?
You're right. So that's the, if you pick one hypothesis to test, you've got better power because, like we mentioned, the corrections hurt your power. But if you pick one hypothesis to test, it doesn't matter how many other possible ones there are. The chance of you getting a false positive for that particular test is 5%, assuming there's no difference to be found. So I would advise you, if you are designing an experiment, I would say, if you can pick one hypothesis test that tells me what I want to know from the experiment, just do that one test. Don't do, all of the tests and then do a correction. If you do that, you will make it much harder when you do the correction to get a statistically significant result.
Yeah, but my point is that if you had done the multiple hypothesis testing, then you wouldn't have gotten the
Right.
significant result in the first place. You only just got lucky,
Right.
That you happened to choose a hypothesis where it was going to work out.
Yeah.
And the reason you got lucky, part of why you got lucky is because you didn't do the multiple comparisons.
Right.
Right?
So that's why I wouldn't do the multiple comparisons. It's
But I mean, the thing would have been wrong, right? So
Right,
it's only
but-
considered right because you only did one test.
right.
But it would have been considered
So
wrong.
if you do one test or you do a bunch of tests with corrections, you have this, and you do the correction correctly, you have the same chance of getting a false positive either way.
So there's a difference between planned and unplanned comparisons, and what you're talking about really is, I think, best described as unplanned. It was like as if you randomly chose one of the tests to do. So, I mean, it literally, if you, to do this correctly, you might have chosen any one of those tests. So, you probably have to use, as I imagine you're going to talk about next, the correction for unplanned comparisons, which decreases your significance, or for which you need much more stringent significance. So I would sort of equate the example that you gave with as if I had already chosen to do 20 or 30 of them, but I only did one. And so I would have made that correction. However, the way I was brought up back in the old days, if you did in fact have 18 or 20 or 30 tests that you had planned to do in advance, then then you could be justified in using your normal significance level. However, if it were me, I'd probably choose a much stricter significance test anyway.
Yeah, that's what I would do as well.
Nate had a question, was that related to this discussion?
Roughly, it's sort of an extension, so let's continue
Okay.
this discussion.
Were you trying to chime in on this particular discussion?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can see situations where you have good reasons from the nature of what you're investigating to believe that some tests are going to be significant and others are not going to be. The case you mentioned with LinkedIn, I don't know what the other questions asked were, but that is the one I would have expected to give that answer, because it's a club effect. People join a club, they tend to have a greater degree of trust and belief in the other members of the club, and so that's a plausible answer for that particular one. The others, you might have been able to say, I don't believe that these people would be trusted, and your tests have actually shown that. So actually, that ensemble of results is exactly what you might have expected if you went in with the right model. What then?
Well, the problem is it's also exactly what we would have expected if that model weren't true.
Yeah.
So if something like this happened, what you might do is say, all right, I have sort of an exploratory result. I picked up this thing which seems to make sense. But what I need to do now is try doing
Bigger
collecting
problem with that question.
with that specific question and nail down that question.
Fair enough.
So we've done a lot of talk so far about frequentist statistics.
Uh-oh.
And oh no, I love them. That's but I have many friends who are Bayesians, and I don't fault them for it. And so while I dig myself a hole here, perhaps you can tell me: are there things for the times where I decide I want to try and do some Bayesian type methods that I don't shoot myself in the foot?
That's a difficult question. So there are some advantages. For instance, with sampling to the foregone conclusion, keep looking bias. That basically does not happen for a Bayesian. There's ways you can completely avoid that problem and get sensible answers. So Bayesians don't really do hypothesis testing, right? So there's not advice for Bayesians on these specific problems. And advice on other problems Bayesians might have, I don't think is a talk I'm qualified to give right now, unfortunately.
So we can bug you in a few years then?
Yeah. Other questions? All right. So, like we just heard, everyone seems to be foreshadowing the next two slides of my talk. There are, I guess that means it goes in a logical order. So there are ways of correcting for multiple testing, like we heard. So the simplest way is if I'm going to do 100 tests, I divide my 5% significance threshold by 100. And so then approximately my false positive rate over all of those tests will still only be 5%. But you're making your threshold more stringent, so now your statistical power just takes a nosedive, and you need an enormous sample size. This has happened in some fields where people notice, oh, we should start correcting for multiple comparisons, and they start doing that, but their power keeps getting worse and worse as they do that, and they didn't notice that problem. There's also other methods. There's false discovery rate control, where you're not interested in how many false positives I will get, but how many false positives will there be out of all of the statistically significant results I get. Because if I get a bunch of false positives, that's not so bad if I also get loads of truly significant results. And then you might not worry that you have some false positives. So this lets you be a little looser. This was only really invented in the last 20 years or so. I think the paper came out in 1995 that started this. And then since then, statisticians have been tripping over themselves to apply it to every new field they can find. Several people in our department did that for a while. But you can also carefully choose your research hypotheses so that you don't need to do a bunch of tests. So maybe it makes sense, like you mentioned for this LinkedIn study, that certain questions you'd expect there to be different answers. Maybe if they had gone in and they had no idea in advance what to expect, but they were expecting that on average, LinkedIn members would see these questions as less sensitive than non-members. If they're expecting that, then you don't need to test every one of the 36 or every one of the 27 questions. You can just take an average and do one test comparing all of them. So you can think about what is it I'm expecting to find, what do I want to test, and see if you can pick the one test or the two tests that answer that question, instead of every time you see a number doing a significance test just in case. And sometimes you don't want a test. maybe you don't even expect the effect to be 0. You know there's some effect, you want to know how big it is. Or how big it is really the interesting question, not whether it exists. So maybe you don't even want to test in that case. You want an effect size estimate. And let me give you an example of a case when using significance instead of an effect size test allowed us to turn right at red lights. So right turns on red were only legalized in the 70s during the oil crisis. I won't ask which of you remember that. But the idea was this would be a fuel saving measure because you have to waste less time at red lights. So the various state departments of transportation went and hired consultants, and they told the consultants, tell us whether this change would be dangerous, because we don't want to do it if it would be unsafe. So the consultants went out to these intersections, they put up signs saying you may turn right on red, and then they tracked how many accidents were at these intersections. And they got a small increase in the number of accidents, but it was not statistically significant. So they went and they reported back to the Department of Transportation. They said there's no significant hazard, go ahead, make the change. But it turns out in the years since then, people have collected more data and they've nailed it down. If you look at specifically at accidents that occur at right turns, twice as many bicyclists are getting run over and 60% more pedestrians are getting hit. I say this is only accidents at right turns. It's not twice as many bicyclists overall everywhere. So this amounts to about 100 people getting hit every year as a result of a statistical error. So the problem is statistically insignificant does not mean there's no significant hazard. It means we did not have enough data to prove that there is a significant hazard, but that doesn't mean there is none. If they had to take the confidence interval, they put error bars, they said, it increases the number of accidents by X% plus or minus something. Their error bars would include 0, because they said there's no statistically significant effect, but it would also include a very large increase in the number of accidents. So if they were good consultants, what they would have done is they would have made these error bars, and they'd say, clearly we need more money so we can study this problem in greater detail. But you could use that confidence interval, that estimate, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? The Department of Transportation in 2014 says that each of you is worth $9.2 million. They established this scientifically. And so they could calculate, what's the upper bound on the number of people who are going to get run over, and is that going to turn out to be worth the minuscule fuel savings because you don't get to wait 20 seconds at a red light. And my guess is it's probably not worth it, given that 100 people per year by the DOT's numbers comes out to about $1 billion of people. And if right turns on red cost $1 billion in gas, I'd be very surprised. So let's sort of wrap these problems together and look at what's the overall impact. If I have low power and I make many, many comparisons, what's going to happen to me? Now here I have to revert back to a drug example, a medical example. But you can imagine applying this to many of the papers, like at SOUPS or other conferences. Suppose I'm testing 100 potential drugs, cancer drugs, say. And we have 50% power to detect the effects that are there. And suppose only 10 of the drugs actually work. We don't know which 10. We don't even know that it's 10. We're trying to find that out. So graphically, I'll represent this as, here's a grid of all 100 drugs. And I've highlighted the ones that are the truly effective ones. But remember I said we had 50% power to detect the effects of those drugs. So for half of them, I will get a statistically significant result. It will probably be exaggerated. So when it goes to clinical trials, I'll probably be disappointed because the effect isn't as big as I thought. I'll miss half of the good drugs because I have only 50% power. But then there's these 90 other drugs that don't work, and we're doing the normal 5% significance test. So 5% of them I'm not going to get statistical significance, or I am going to get statistical significance. So that comes out to about 5 out of 90 on average. So I've got 10 statistically significant results, and half of them are wrong. And the other half are probably exaggerated. So now you can begin to see why I had that paper called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. It turns out that in a lot of fields, 50% power is actually optimistic. If you do reviews where you look at some particular effect and the meta-analysis of a bunch of papers on how big that effect is, and you look back, all right, well, how good was the power of the individual papers? It's usually terrible, something like 20%. So you can begin to see why people say most published research findings are false. Now, there's been a lot of controversy over that claim, as you may imagine. So I can't conclusively say most published research findings are false, but you can see why statisticians are suspicious. So what do? We're putting out results which do not stand up to statistical scrutiny, which the statistical evidence we put forward does not support the conclusions we make. And replication is rare. It was, I think, very good that Laser last year published a replication attempt. But that doesn't happen very often because the journal editor thinks that's boring, usually. So, and even when a replication is done, the original paper is going to be cited for many years henceforth. This has been observed to happen in several fields, where even if some original study is contradicted by some enormous, groundbreaking, double-blind, perfect study, half the people in the field don't notice and keep citing the original one as though they were true. So we should learn from other fields, like medicine. In medicine, evidence-based medicine has been a big thing for a while now. They've been trying to figure out how they can solve these problems. In medicine, you need to plan your sample size and statistical analysis in advance to get IRB approval, to get grant funding. And physicians and clinicians often talk to biostatisticians when they're planning their studies. For example, our department at Carnegie Mellon, in the statistics department, we don't actually believe in statistical consulting. We don't have a statistical consulting center. You can't come in with your Excel spreadsheet of data and say, how do I get significance? We don't do that. But if you come before you start the study and you say, here's what I want to find out, what's the best way to do it? We will collaborate from the beginning, help design the study, help figure out what the best way to do it is, because we find it impossible to resist interesting problems. Statisticians are easy to nerd snipe. You can do that pretty well. Because the great thing about our field is you can solve problems in many different fields of science, so new interesting things keep popping up. And funders in our fields and fields other than medicine should start requiring these sorts of plans. If you're going to say, I want to study X phenomenon, and so I need money so I can recruit this many subjects and do this experiment, they should require you to convince them that the money you're asking for and the sample size you're asking for is sufficient to find what you're looking for. And otherwise, they're wasting their money. You want to do a study, but if you did a power calculation, you'd find there's no way you're going to find what you're looking for. One thing I think may be more controversial, and we can discuss this, is publishing protocols in advance. In medicine, this has started to happen. Like the Lancet has started allowing this to happen, where if you write the protocol for a study, describing how I'm going to recruit patients, how many I'm going to recruit, how I chose the sample size, how I'm going to analyze the data, all that stuff, before you even collect the data, you can submit this to the journal, and they will review it the same way a normal paper is reviewed. They will accept it if they like it, and then they commit that when you get the results, you collect the data, no matter what your results are, they will publish them. So it avoids the publication bias of, well, it's not significant, so don't bother putting that in our journal. But I think that may be easier to implement in medicine, where there's already the established bureaucracy requiring a protocol, than in other fields.
I'm wondering if there is an analog between publishing protocols in advance. I mean, it sounds like here the journal reviews it and so on, but does not actually publish the protocol until the study has been done.
So I think in many cases they make them public once the review is done.
Okay. I'm thinking the many eyes theory behind claims for lower error rates in open sort of software, and we can argue about whether that happens or not. But it seems that there's a similar phenomenon here. If it's out there, anybody who has an interest in that area is free to read and comment upon
Yeah,
protocol. Even if it's been reviewed and accepted, it may be badly flawed.
right.
So that would be an interesting thing to see if it has a
Yeah.
desired effect.
So I think in medicine, they're fortunate that they're willing to do those sorts of studies where they will empirically, find a way of measuring study quality, however that's done, and compare whether studies with protocols published in advance do better on these standard measures. I don't know of one that's been done on that yet, but that would be a very interesting test. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would also complain, well, what if someone steals my protocol and finishes before I do? I expect in medicine that's not as easy to do. What you need to find a bunch of lung cancer patients or something, that takes a while. So the study authors are way ahead of you there. But maybe when it's something you can just put on Mechanical Turk and get results in 2 days, maybe people will be worried about that. So in medicine, there are checklists. We talked about checklists a bit yesterday, and these are specifically for published papers saying, these are the details you need to report so that we can evaluate the evidence. So you need to report your sample sizes, how you chose them, all the tests you did, all of these, I think it's several page long checklists, so that when we are doing a review, we have all of the details we need to figure out if you did it right. Nature has a checklist. There's an international committee of medical journal editors that's been working on Consort and a bunch of others. There's like a couple dozen now, I think, for different kinds of medical trials. And these checklists are starting to be used as part of peer review. They assign someone and say, you need to look at this checklist, make sure they follow it. Or they assign the authors to fill out the form and say, I covered this on page 3, this on page 7, go through it in detail. Nature and Science have started making statisticians available in peer review. They've retained statisticians. If the reviewer says, I don't know whether I believe this, I'm not sure if this is right, they have someone to ask. And then like we heard yesterday, if all else fails, if you've made the analysis code available in the data, then a sufficiently bored or interested statistician could read the code and figure out if what you did makes any sense. I've actually tried that a couple times, and typically people's code's horrifying, and so it slows me down a lot, but in theory it would be really nice. So we could do all those things, but really it comes down to a basic problem. You need to think first and ask questions later. You need to think about your sample size before you start your study. You need to think about what tests I want to run, whether I want to do a test, whether I want a confidence interval, which things would be relevant, what do I need to correct for, all those things. Because if you don't do that and you just willy-nilly collect as much data as you feel like, run all of the tests you can think of, most of your results will be exaggerations or false positives. At this point, I really don't want to write another book. So please save me from that.
Great talk and very interesting. So I'll just start with an anecdote. So when I tried to talk with statisticians, the typical answer was, go away, we care only about big data nowadays. So you care only for participants for 100, I don't care about your problems. So we learned a lot of things in my group when we started doing studies. One of the examples is going to be next, presented by Yulong, where we did a lot of things wrong and learned the hard way. So, for example, learned all the way that, yeah, we should have really do the power analysis first. But what you kind of didn't say in your talk, that you need to estimate the effect size, especially if there's no studies on that. So, for example, in our case, we wouldn't know in advance what do we kind of expect the password policies to do or whatever. So
yeah, if you have no prior knowledge of what the effect should be, then it's hard to choose a sample size. Sort of common advice that we give is, okay, then what effect would be interesting enough for you to care about?
yes. The other thing is that you don't want to write another book, but could you recommend one that would be really good? So when we started doing this, I bought a lot of books on, and a lot of them focus on the tests and, for example, a gloss over that. Yeah, you kind of should do this power analysis, but this book is not for it.
Yeah, so what I wrote was not a guide on doing these things. It was a guide on how people do them badly. There's some, I think there's some sort of standard books. You may have seen Jacob Cohen's Power Analysis in the Behavioral Sciences, or something like that, which I think is a classic by now. There's a new book called Understanding the New Statistics.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Which is about, well, you don't always need tests. Maybe you really want a confidence interval. Maybe there's a power what you want to say. I want to measure a fact with this amount of precision. And that's a pretty good book, I think.
What was the first book again, please?
The first from Cohen was, I think it's Power Analysis for the Behavioral Sciences. Someone here may remember the title better than I do.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to go to break.
So I was going to ask you a question about kind of implicit statistical testing, where I think this comes up a lot, especially in computer security, where you'll say do a survey, for example. Let's take that LinkedIn example, and then you'll say, okay, well, let me look at the results here, and let's just say I had 100 people and 50 in each group, and let's say for, the results were the same for all the questions. It was, 25 breakdown. And then for the remaining question about, this club, do you trust people in the same club? You see, there were 40 people that answered yes in one group and 10 that answered yes in the other group. And you say, oh, well, just for this test, or just for this question, I'll do a statistical test. But you've kind of done this procedure where you look through all the questions and say, well, based on the responses, these were the same in both groups. I don't even bother doing a test.
Yeah.
So what would you do in such a case?
I would probably want to correct for that, because if you had collected different data, you probably would have tested a different one of the questions. So it's equivalent to just doing a bunch of tests. The statistical uncertainty when you're doing one test, it tries to account for if you had collected a bunch of data, done this experiment repeatedly and done this specific test every time. But it doesn't account for if I did this experiment repeatedly, I would have done a different test every time and improved my chances of a false positive.